The questions that we run into this time uh, are going to be questions some of us are very familiar with, and if not, we're not familiar with them. We are aware of it. Um, It'd be nice to have a dream that says once Luther started this process, and then we started seeing the little breakouts, that everything was smooth and congenial, and everybody got together and kind of shook everybody's hand. But that's not the way it worked. It didn't work that way back in the Bible. Paul constantly had to bicker and try to correct his churches and try to get them back on track. When the author of the Revelation wrote and put in there about the seven churches, which, by the way, uh, it wasn't written necessarily to seven churches. It's all about the number seven. Seven is the perfect number. And so for the writer and the author, these seven churches represented the entire church. It's kind of like one of these things you read it and you plug your church in somewhere and see where you fit on the chart. But uh, there was this suddenly a tension of what happened when in my generation, uh, as I experienced what was going on in the boomer generation, which was at that tail end of what I would term traditional family. Uh, I experienced the tensions that went on at an early age between holiness and Pentecostal churches who pointed their fingers at mainline churches because they said that the mainline churches were too liberal, and the mainline churches pointed their fingers at the Anglicans and the Episcopals who said they were too much like the Catholics. And then the Catholics looked back on all of us, kind of feeling sorry for us, like a lost puppy, saying, I wish you'd just come on home and we'd all be happy. And so it became, in that era, an us versus them world. We have it right, we move it on. In the 60s, there was this upflow of evangelical preaching who said the Pope was an antichrist. They talked about the Catholic Church being the equivalent of the mark of the beast. Uh, Preaching was heavy handed and hellfire and brimstone. Uh, Dogmas were deeply entrenched in churches. You believe what I believe, or you're going to hell. And it really pushed it on deep into it. I made a reference to a cartoon. Don't tell me I'm going to be who I am type of a thing. And the Jesus movement started. In 1967, a small group of people went in, rented a storefront, and decided that they would do what no church had been doing. They were going to invite people in who didn't look like everybody else. You didn't have to wear a special kind of clothes to come to church. You didn't have to look a certain way. You didn't have to read a Bible a certain way. You could just come in and be cool. And in fact, there's one of the big rock and roll songs that came out of this era. Jesus is just all right with me. And this group began to kind of show what was going on in a culture about doing things differently. Uh, they would go out into parks and beaches. They would baptize in the ocean. They would come in jeans and sandals. Uh, their preaching sounded a lot like the Great Awakening with Jonathan Edwards. A lot of it was hellfire and brimstone to kind of get you to turn and realize what was going on. Uh, Hal Lindsey wrote this book called The Late Great Planet Earth, which told us in just a few days we were all going to burn up and predicted all of that. Uh, and so you began to have this shift within a religious realm. It was not a denomination, it was a fringe movement that was occurring. I was talking with Dale this morning right outside the sanctuary before church started. And in the conversation, he had mentioned that he had gone to Asbury Seminary. And I said, well, I went to Asbury once, and my seminary was over at Emory. Uh, I said, I went to Asbury once in 1972. I said, I traveled up there with a bunch from the college I went to a music festival called Ichthus, which is still going on today, by the way. And so we go up to Wilmore, Kentucky in our bell bottom button fly jeans with patches on them. And if you would think long hair was long for our college, if it came to the top of my ears, that was long hair. But everybody just came in free spirit. This was really before the birth of contemporary music, Christian music. So what these people were doing is that they were taking the most popular rock and roll songs and turning them into Christian lyrics. The one that always stood out to me was the guy that took Starry, Starry Night, uh, Don Lean, and changed it from Van Gogh to the life of Christ and used those images and made it in there. The big symbol for patches and bumper stickers and everything was one way Jesus. And there were not a lot of strings attached to this. You just believe in Jesus, and there you go. And all these things were turning around, changing a culture. While we were in college, we put on a musical by Ralph Carmichael and Kirk Kaiser called Natural High to try to speak to Christian kids about what was going on. And they used these cultural terms. It's a scientific formula effectively reduced to simple terms so everyone can try. It's a perfectly legal, non-chemically induced, logically natural high. And of course, the whole music was about the natural high of Jesus, not the natural high of drugs and other things. And so we began to make this big turn. And in this big turn, uh, we find a birth of a new musical genre called contemporary Christian music. And I can remember uh, people like B.J. Thomas moved out of his art and moved into Christian music almost exclusively. Uh, Names like Stephen Curtis Chapman, Amy Grant. I think we went and saw her while she was basically a teenager in Birmingham. Uh, Rich Mullins. I don't know if any of y'all know who Rich Mullins is. He wrote Our God. Our God is an awesome God. And he also wrote one called It's About as Useless as Screen Doors on a Submarine, which was about people who had faith without works. Uh, he worked extremely strong with the Native American cultures, and he sang his music and brought his money back to work that, and was tragically killed. Uh, Michael Card is one that never really made the huge splash, but was one of the few early contemporary Christian writers who was deeply theological. His music is as close to Scripture as a hymn book is, and I followed him closely throughout my career and in my years because I loved the way he would use the imagery of the music to tell stories that we were familiar with. Uh, One that we most probably are familiar with are people like Michael W. Smith and his music. And one of the things, and I think I'll bring this out in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and say it so that it comes in here. There is a major difference in the music between what we would term traditional church and contemporary music and contemporary worship. The traditional church has hymns which sing songs about theology and personal experience. And so it becomes almost intellectual in some sense of what you do. The music in a contemporary setting is affirmation. It's not worried about everything else. What it does, makes a statement, and then it wants to be sure you understand that concept. And this is one of the probably the most. I'm going to stop that right there. That phrase that you heard is sung in a song that lasts 10 minutes. And it is that one, the phrase. Hallelujah, the Lord God Almighty reign. And and when I say it's affirmational, it uses that statement to go over and over and over and over and over again. If you go to a contemporary worship service, many times you'll hear them, they'll sing a song and then they'll sing the chorus 17 times at the end. They'll make sure you catch the idea of things. So, uh, so as you moved into the music, also another major player on the shift of culture was made by the American Bible Society uh, in Good News for Modern Man. When I remember when it came out, you could buy the, and then you came into what we call the new church movement. A new style was starting. All these churches were going on out here doing this contemporary worship, doing their own music, and the church was looking at it from the outside saying, they're taking all our folks. We got to do something about that. And when something like that happens, whether it's in business or it's in church, the response is, we got to do that too. And so the church then said, what we've got to do is to bring these people in. Uh, and they called it contemporary, which is kind of strange because anything that's happening at the moment is contemporary. Believe it or not, the Quaker movement was a contemporary movement. The Methodist movement was a contemporary movement. Uh, each one, as it moved on, captured the idea and the imagination of a new generation. And now this new church thing was catching on and it was causing a stir because they did things differently. Uh, Bill Hybels, who is pastor of Willow Creek, if you've ever heard of the Willow Creek Church or the Willow Creek Society, a humongous church. Uh, he was interviewed by Peter Jennings in a documentary called The Name of God. And he said the teams went door to door asking a question. The first question was, do you go to church? And if the person said no, the next question was, why? And the response usually, he said, was, I don't like old fashioned music and I don't like old fashioned sermons. Now, the question that was not asked was, have you been to church? Have you heard those old fashioned sermons? Have you heard that old fashioned music? So you don't know if that's a real or if that's just something that they perceive. But this movement that started in coffee houses didn't look like churches. They didn't dress like churches. Their music was loud and instrumental. And so now we have to move into things. And so what I perceived in this is that there were five major shifts in worship style that were brought about when the contemporary worship started. Uh, I had mentioned the music up at the Ichthus Festival, but I also remember in churches, especially in youth groups, who would take songs like Amazing Grace and sing it to tunes like Peaceful, Easy Feeling or The House of the Rising Sun. We'd put music like that. They would take music written in 4/4 and swing it back around to 3/4 timing so it would have a different feel. And then it even reached a point where music teams in contemporary worship would begin to write their own music and have these praise teams. Uh, from my observation, this new style of music held a twofold event. First, in every contemporary service I have ever attended, the expectation is when they are going to sing a song, you have to stand up. And you have to stand up while they sing the song, all 197 verses of it. Uh, and then uh, you're listening to a song that many times might be playing on the radio, or maybe they wrote it, or maybe it's a solo style song, and it's not one that congregation can usually sing. So you are a participant by listening, not by joining in. And so music became part of the proclamation, uh, not so much about participation. Although, let me say this if you go to those services on a regular basis, you finally begin to learn some of the music. Fred Craddock, Dr. Fred Craddock, who was my homiletics professor, my preaching professor when I was in seminary, used to say that every church has its canon of hymns. Uh, and I found that true when I was in pastoral ministry. You go to one church and they would like this set of songs. You go to the next church and they have another set of songs that they know and they sing. And so it was the same way uh, with the contemporary. They had their own canon of songs about what was going on. Uh, the music was a lot of times it was narrative. Uh, it was inclined to be more affirmational, as I said. Uh, and there is such a difference that it's almost shocking from one point to the next. Uh, there's a story that had been told, and I did this in the book, of the old farmer who went down to the city to take care of some things. And while he was there over the weekend, he went to church. And when he came back, his wife said, "Well, did you go to church?" And he said, "Yes." "Well, did you like it?" He said, "I'm not sure. Their music was strange." And she said, "Well, tell me about the music, how it's different from our music." He said, "Well, when I go to church here, we sing, 'The brown cow eats green grass.' When I went to this church, it was the cow, the cow, the cow, 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 the brown cow eats grass, grass eats green grass." But music is a part of the culture. Uh, and if you'll notice, looking across the spectrum of the contemporary worship service, when you look at praise bands, probably more often than not, the musicians that create praise bands are people in my generation who were old rock and roll players who found a place to play guitar again. And now some of us are getting too old to play, so there's a younger generation that they're feeding into. Uh, the next was about drama, and when contemporary worship started, drama was an extremely big part of things. Uh, you had thematic sermons that we'll talk about later, but in order to be a part of the worship, you would have a short play or a skit which would set the stage for what the minister was going to talk about that day. Uh, Back in the early years, they would call those miracle plays or morality plays. Uh, in early Catholic worship, when everything was in Latin and that people didn't understand it, they would go to church, and after church, there would be a group who would put on a play, a short play, which basically said, "This is what you just learned about." And so that's how this came about. It seems to me that that part of it is beginning to kind of wane a little bit. I don't see as much drama and little play productions as much as I do now. Uh, the worship space has changed. I remember growing up in a church when you were just beginning to use microphones, but you didn't want to let the people know that you had that. You would hide the microphone behind a big vase or something. Speakers would be hidden behind things. You did not want a wire to be seen at all. That was just not part of a church. I grew up in Talladega, and I was there before the track was there. I was in college when the track started in 1969. But they had, in their wisdom, run speaker wires to the back of the church. And it was just two lead bare wire that went to the back. It was not a coaxial that had a shield on it. And you'd be in worship service on race Sunday, and all these CB radios that would pass the church, their signal would bleed in on those wires. And a lot of times you didn't hear what you heard was not what you wanted to hear in church. And so we got where they cut it off. But now it doesn't matter. You see wires hanging from everywhere. Microphones are sticking up even in our sanctuary. You see the microphones and things uh, everywhere hanging there. Uh, we don't even really need hymnals because we have the technology to put things on walls and see them there. There was a wisdom. A lot of people didn't like it, but I didn't like the words put on a screen on the back of the sanctuary because I'm the type of person that I have to have the little dots underneath the words so I can follow the music. Uh, but the musicians tell us it always sounds better because people look up to the screens and sing, and the singing always sounds much better because they're looking up instead of looking down. Uh, the chancel area was turned from chancel into stage. Uh, the the pulpit was no longer a focal point, and in fact, in many contemporary churches, you won't see a cross or a pulpit or a baptismal font. Here again, Bill Hybels was talking about this, and he said that we don't have a cross on the wall, a Bible present before the people, or even a baptismal font, because these are things which may intimidate people who come to church for the first time. Ginghamsburg Church, which is up in Tip City, Ohio, right outside of Dayton, which at one time was the fastest and largest United Methodist church east of the Mississippi. Uh, their pastor said they would use secular music as prelude music because they didn't want to offend somebody when they came to church on Sunday. Now, my argument for that is if you come to church, what do you expect? I think I would expect a religious music being played rather than or secular music. Then you had proclamation of the word. Even up through my generation, pastors were usually, especially Methodist pastors, were told to preach from the lectionary, those set texts that you would use to follow the life of Jesus. Uh, I have a 5 drawer file cabinet of sermons that I have collected over the years. The first 3 of those drawers are from the Gospels, and the rest of it is from the rest of the New Testament and the Old Testament. You preach the gospel of Jesus most of the time. You had a process. Now we have made this transition out of a lectionary exegetical preaching, which means you take the text and you dissect it, to a thematic sermon process. You pick a topic and then you preach on the topic. And especially in the contemporary church, it started out where the proclamations were becoming more social conscious. What makes you a better person? What makes you someone who reaches out? What makes you a better parent? How do you handle your finances? These were things that made uh, big shifts and were probably some of the loudest complaints from the old school theologians. Uh, but you had these social series being going on. Uh, but I will say this: they need to hear it somewhere, and sometimes we all need to hear it. So I'm not. Don't take me saying throw that out the back door. There's a difference in concept here, and I'm not putting either side down. Uh, Part of this too is the way they approach the church year. It's it's not so much that once the contemporary church came inside the church, one of the things that happened was the contemporary church didn't want to look like the traditional service. And so they didn't say the Lord's Prayer. They didn't do the Apostles' Creed. They served communion every now and then. You would have those types of things going on that would be different. This little book I was telling you about is an argument against that. We can say that we can be United Methodist and have a traditional and a contemporary worship service. You can have a contemporary worship service that shows us our Methodist heritage and it still be contemporary. What's wrong with saying the Lord's Prayer? together in a contemporary worship service. Uh, Sermons became topical, and I know some people say, well, you can do those type of sermons just right off the top of your head. Well, not necessarily, because I've done sermon work, and it's not an easy thing. Uh, and finally, is the issue of theology. Uh, what happens when I was at Christ Church at Oxford? Right across the street from the main door at Oxford, uh, at Christ Church College, was a church called St. Aldate's Church, which was one of the oldest churches in Oxford, and for some reason had fallen out of repair and had been empty for some time, and they had just gone through a long process of completely renovating the church. It had been bought out by a group, and they had completely renovated it and turned it into a contemporary style worship church. And I just happened to be sitting at breakfast one day, and close to me were two Anglican priests. And they started this conversation about St. Aldate's Church. And he said, I just can't believe what they do over there. They bring in the Eucharist and they serve it, and then they just sit the elements right there on the front of the chancel, and they don't cover them or anything. And I thought, well, uh, did Jesus cover his elements at the end of the table? Of course, my mother-in-law always accused me that I blamed everything on Jesus. But so part of all this theology is in the off street church, out of church, contemporary church, is that so many of them would say, I don't like the way they're doing things over there, so I'm going to take my church and I'm going to start me a church. And so somebody with a heart full of Jesus in the Bible goes somewhere and they start into a church and get themselves a little congregation that have had no theological education, have had no biblical instruction. And so their theology just goes all over the place. Uh, which brought us to that point about the concept between what is the difference between traditional and contemporary. Uh, Reformation, every time we made a branching of that tree that I brought, it was all because somebody said, our church can do it better than your church can. And I think I mentioned about 2 weeks ago, I had gone out for lunch on Sunday and just kind of happened up on a young man in conversation with the lady. And he made this comment, our church does it right. And I like the way our church does it. I was tempted to have a conversation with that young man, but he probably wouldn't have wanted to engage with me on that. Uh, but because of that, sometimes these things go a little wayward. And so the church said, if you can't beat them, join them. So we opened up our gyms, we opened up our fellowship halls, we created our contemporary worship services. We had two worship services going on at the same time, or a lot of them like ours. One service would run one time, one service would run another. In the early days of the contemporary service movement, as we brought them into church, what happened was there became a distrust even inside the church. The traditional people didn't trust the people on the contemporary music side or the contemporary worship side. They don't do things right. We do it right on this side. They do it wrong over there. The people from the contemporary church look at the traditional church and say, you're stuck in your ways. And suddenly you had this battle going on between who is right. I did workshops going to churches who had that problem to try to sit down with both sides of the group, the contemporary and the traditional, and say, it's okay. You don't have to all do it the same way, but we all have to love Jesus and each other. So it created a tension and moving on. And so as the time has flowed uh, into our day, the contemporary church that is inside the church, like ours, we don't really have those tensions anymore. Not to a point of disruption. Uh, People are free to say, "Oh, you go to that service. Well, I hope you enjoy that one. I like this one over here." And there's not a battle or a squawk about it. So those types of things have moved apart. Uh, the tension of pointing fingers and saying I'm right and you're wrong, a lot of that has diminished uh, down the line. One of the things that I have found out about communities is that when I see a someone that goes to a contemporary church away from a church, I'll ask them, who are you connected to? And they'll say, oh, we're a non-denominational church. Wrong. There was a church in Albertville that split off from First Baptist Church. And its title, what was its title? The Fellowship. It said the Fellowship Church, and underneath it, it said a non-traditional Southern Baptist church. There's no such thing as a non-traditional Southern Baptist church. Uh, but what they will say is we have based our theology on something else. Most of the churches that started with a person who went out to be the pastor of that church, who brought his theological experience with him, be it Baptist or Methodist or Pentecostal. That became the theology of that group of people. I did have one time tell me, well, we started our church based on the text of First Timothy. Really? Yeah. That's our church is based on First Timothy. And so and they pointed out uh, a text in First Timothy 3, but they forgot to read First Timothy 2. First Timothy 2. I want everyone everywhere to lift innocent hands toward heaven and pray without being angry or without arguing with each other. I would like for women to wear modest and sensible clothing. They should not have fancy hairdos or wear expensive clothes or put on jewelry made of gold or pearls. Women who claim to love God should do helpful things for others, and they should learn by being quiet and paying attention, and they should be silent and not be allowed to teach or tell men what to do. Well, then you turn over to chapter 3. That's why the officials of the church must have a good reputation and be faithful in marriage. They must be self-controlled, sensible, well-behaved, friendly to strangers, able to teach, must not be heavy drinkers or troublemakers. Church officers should be serious and have a clear conscience. They have to prove themselves. Women must also be serious. They must not gossip or be heavy drinkers. They must be faithful in everything. Church officers must be faithful in the church. After all, the church of the living God is the strong foundation of truth. The churches I've been to, they haven't followed Timothy 2. They try to hang on to Timothy 3, but even that's a stretch. 21st century women are not necessarily quiet in church. In fact, I have pointed out more than once that if it were not for women, the Christian church may not even exist. Many of churches that Paul started were bankrolled by wealthy women. So you have to kind of go back and check your facts on some of it. Whether we want to accept it or not, the contemporary church is creating its own tradition and really, in essence, needs a branch on the tree all by itself. It has its own traditions. Its music is different. They dress the way they want to. Their worship pattern, that liturgy, is different. And those types of things, their music, their rhythm, their energy, their sermon styles, embed itself into what then becomes a tradition. And these traditions become birth out of epiphany moments. A group of people get together, they experience something, and they want that experience to happen again and again and again. And so they work and do everything in their power to relive that. Um, Reverend John Driver once said that I believe these terms, traditional and contemporary, are unclear terms and divisive in the church. When I studied philosophy, I learned a fundamental principle: everything is a matter of definition. And when it's unclear, we need to have a conversation. Uh, I spoke earlier in the first class about when I first wrote this book in 2010, and I updated now. It was all because of a Sunday school class and the battle inside a Sunday school class. And that tension about they're not doing it right uh, is beginning to come in a full circle, because now we have to define, well, what is the it that you don't understand? Who has a right to define what it is? Who has authority to say it is right or it is wrong? If you know James Carville, he's usually a political analyst, but he was speaking to a man one evening about church issues. And he said this: do you want to be a church that's chasing out heretics, or do you want to be a church that's bringing in converts? And that's just it. The battle line itself needs to disappear, and it has in a lot, because it's not about what we do, how we do, when we do, as much as it is about what we as a people who call ourselves Christian, what are we doing to bring other people who are not Christian into our fellowship? So it's really a re-reformation that has happened over the last few years. Uh, for those who would never enter the door of a tall steepled church, would enter the door of a storefront church or slip in the side door of a church fellowship hall. And that's what ministry and gospel is all about: just getting the people together. Um, we just try our very best as who we are to make it all about Jesus. Questions or comments about any of that before we get anywhere else?
Yes, I have one.
Okay.
I've been trying to talk to people about it. When the Church of the Highlands opens down the street, they're gonna come out with a magnificent marketing campaign, and it's gonna affect our church. It's gonna be raising curiosity, if nothing else, about it. Um, and, um, as you say, that is a different culture than either one of our services is accustomed to. And it affects all the churches in this area. Uh, are we gonna sit back and just let it happen, or are we gonna have a plan of, well, okay, it's coming, so
Right.
if we're gonna
So
do
what
this,
we
we're gonna do that, but it's coming.
Right. And the task, in fact, my mentor, Leonard Sweet, always said, whatever you do in church, in your church, he said, make sure that it's the best for Jesus. He's the one that told us that the last thing we should do as a church is go out and buy store brand coffee. He said, when you have coffee for people to drink in between services or before service or in the contemporary service, he said, you better have the best coffee money can buy. And really, that's part of what's going on here. Uh, if people go over there and snoop and experience something, that's fine. But I hope that we're strong enough here that people will say, that's fine, but I like this. And I buy into this better. That's the hope.
We need to define ourselves.
We do need to find ourselves. And part of the larger uh, mega church event is more about production than anything else. Uh, They have all the screens. They have their contemporary churches now that have multiple campuses that worship independently around, and then at a certain time punch a button and the preacher preaches to 5 congregations at one time. If that's what you want out of your pastor, well, good luck with that. I can sit at home and watch it on the screen. And now and this is what we'll talk about next week as we talk about post-COVID church. The transition now from moving out of what we would call contemporary Christian worship and what has come now into a technical field of worship. I really didn't like that word traditional because traditional makes it seem anxious. At one point in time, every time I was talking about a topic like this, I would use the word classical worship versus modern worship uh, to delineate things. Uh, we talk about the Christian denominations. And of course, the question is always raised: what separates our faith community from other faith communities? Uh, and we've been hearing that almost every Sunday morning for quite a while, because at least from my perspective, and I've been associated with Trinity for years, but I've not been an active inner part of Trinity for that long. But you never hear the word Trinity without the word mission being spoken, outreach. And so that is, I think, one of the things that separates our church from others. And that's what we hear from our leadership. What's your thoughts on something like that? Is that what separates us? We just one off?
Well, I think that's certainly a characteristic, strong characteristic of this specific congregation. There are other churches, I'm sure, that share that as well. When I read that question, though, I tend to see the Christian community, say it that way, I've noticed tends to divide, and I realize this is an oversimplification, into what I would call more of the mainline theological denominations, which could include non-denominational churches, and those that are often described as fundamentalists, which have a different theological uh, take on things. And I see that as a really as a major divide within the overall Christian church. I guess you put the Catholics,
they kind of hide out in the corner.
Well, they're kind of in their own.
Yeah, they are.
Area.
One of the things that has been a major draw to fundamentalist churches is that the big strength of a fundamentalist church is that they will tell you what to do and what you cannot do. And there's especially younger adults and younger people are searching for a way, and they go to those churches and they feel like they're being told the way. Now I know what I can do and what I can't do, and that is the bedrock of Methodism. We don't tell you what you can you can't do. What you need here is to find a connection with Christ and connect it to your own life. So that creates that. I've noticed a lot of articles in the last year or so uh, about things coming out of the Vatican trying to push the Roman Church into modern times, and a lot of the things that they're trying to do to appeal, because they're the same way as almost all the other churches, where they're losing membership. Well, they don't really lose membership because once you're baptized in the church, you're on the roll forever. but attendance has waned a lot. You're hearing of churches being closed left and right. I think it was in Chicago not long ago. 7 churches were closed at one time, simply because there weren't enough people to fund the necessaries of that.
Well, sure, was it an observation I've made? I'm not on the church council, but I've been attending all the meetings. And they have been working very hard on long-range planning, purposing, where we ought to be heading, admissions and so on. And the thing that strikes me as being very critical is it's being led by young women. So maybe.
to where to meet. And,
So, of course, all the time I've been here at church, my generation has been leading things.
right,
But now it's the young women who are stepping up
stepping up.
and making themselves heard.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's amazing. Wonderful.
Well, and part of that speaks to the culture. I don't want to get political, but in my ethics class, and I used to teach my ethics, and we'd have to get on some political things, even though I hated it with a passion. I told them one day, I said, I think I could solve a lot of the problems with our nation if we would just elect an entirely female Congress. I said, when you look at Congress, I said, the women at least sit down and talk to each other. The men want to fuss and fight and throw fists. I said, that's what we need. We need somebody to sit down and hash it out, like what we would used to call old politics. You come to a compromise and move on. And so part of that is generational because women are finding themselves in power. They're no longer the one who has to stand behind. They can now be the leaders of the world.
Don't speak, listen to your husband.
They're not Timothy too, that's for sure. We talk about the translation. A lot of the churches, especially contemporary churches, will use a thing called the Message, which is, in my opinion, a disaster. It's not a translation at all. It's a
Commentary.
it is the person reads a couple of different translations and then puts it in his own words. That's exactly the way the Living Bible happened. It was uh, an opinion on text. Uh, and that what struck me one Sunday morning. A guy got up to read the text of the day, and he was reading the Message. He was talking about the man who prepared the feast, the wedding feast. He was talking about the pot roast being ready to come out of the oven. But I don't think that's exactly what Jesus said. But I have noticed, and I think Mitchell did it as well as Dietrich. When he gets ready to read the scripture, he's very particular about saying, now, the version we're reading from today, uh, my version is the New Revised Standard. I'm old school, and I admit it. Uh, but the conversion, the CEV that we read at church is an extremely strong book, although it has things that kind of upset us. Uh, we don't like to read in conjunctions, the do not versus the don'ts. The biggest thing that I have a hurdle jumping over is every time we would, in the old text, would say, Jesus, the Son of Man, is listed as the human one. But in reality, when you go back to the true Aramaic Hebrew understanding of what Jesus was saying, it was closer to the human one versus Son of Man. So I'll give them that. We could have a show of hands by saying which style of worship you prefer. I don't want to get into legal things, but there are those times, you know, and that's one of the things I experience here. There's people that go to both worship services. One goes, I'll go to this one this week. Well, I got something going on. I think I'll go to, and there's not a tension about that, or at least I've not experienced that.
Yeah, we started, I guess, at Trinity with the traditional, but quickly shifted to the contemporary when we had kids.
Right, right.
So we were in that phase of life. Now our kids are early 20s. Our son will still come to church with us, but we've all gone back to the traditional. So now I'm struggling. I'm going to have a different word as well because we're a couple of generations through, as you said,
Right.
contemporary church. So now it's a tradition, but we used to call it big church. So we go to big church now. So we phase of life that
Right.
probably
Right.
for us. I started Baptist growing up with the family, and so King James Bible and in that, and
Married a Methodist.
married a Methodist, and in that sort of felt
Right.
right at that time. There wasn't any particular reason other than coming out of college, kind of basically re-engaging.
Right. Right.
But we re-engaged traditional because that's what we were familiar with,
Right.
and then life took us a different way,
Right.
and here we are back again. So,
Well, it kind of catches me sometimes, when they have the celebration of seniors in high school, we don't celebrate that in traditional worship. We celebrate the contemporary
oh
service
yeah,
where they are.
so you shift over for that one day.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was really interesting though, when I asked your son about, cause I said, why do you prefer traditional? And he said, well, because the contemporary service seems more like entertainment. And it was really interesting hearing his perspective
Yeah.
on that. And I've heard that from others too. Talking about Church of the Highlands, I have a colleague who goes to the one in Madison, and he's his faith, I would say, is as strong as I've known anyone.
Mhm.
I mean, he at his desk at work, he's on his breaks, he's in reading scripture, and he's a very, very faithful person. And I asked him, well, what is your take on the Church of the Highlands? And he said, well, the thing that attracted him there isn't necessarily the worship itself, because it's kind of simulcast.
Mhm.
But he said that he really likes the fact that they do small groups,
Right.
and very much encourage that. And so that made me think, in terms of churches, I think that there are different churches because we all meet our faith in different ways. It's necessary for that. So I don't really see it as being competition with other churches. Yeah, it's true that your congregation might not find what they want or what fulfills them at where they're at right now, and you might go someplace else. Sometimes things like the kids who have friends at other churches that pulls them. But when it comes down to it, if we are, as you said, focused on Jesus and the way and what's right, then how we worship can be different.
And that concept, uh, for a lot of the freestanding type contemporary churches, the small group concept, which is a good Wesleyan concept, as he
That's
started
actually
it,
what brought us to church.
We got married in a small church. We didn't want to go to a big church. It was not in our, we just didn't want to. And we came here specifically for a biblical archaeology class. And so we stayed. But the big church was a kind of a turnoff.
Right.
Until we got here, I liked everybody.
That's a struggle we're going through right now. With these decisions about changing worship times, and a lot of the struggle underneath all of this is about the small group gathering. How do we reach out to a contemporary group who's kind of caught in a shift, and make sure they have small groups to attend? A lot of the contemporary services, all they have on Sunday morning is a worship service. All the small groups meet other days of the week or at other places in people's homes. And that concept has been very successful. We talk about technologies. We don't have a screen in our church, and we're probably one of the few that doesn't drop down a screen behind us. We have all the other technologies, as far as we have microphones and all that kind of stuff. And of course, if you step out into the narthex of the church, you can have it full bore and see all the things out there.
Of course, the cross-connect service has all technology.
Oh yes. Mhm. Yeah. And that was part of the tension in the early days, because the contemporary service was taking a big chunk of the budget out of the regular church, because they needed projectors and screens and microphones and sound mixing that you didn't need in the traditional worship service.
Well, the feel with when we first went to the C&C service, it was in the gym. And people were sitting side by side. It had a very good fellowship to it. But when they moved to the new room, they spent all that money on the new room to kind of, oh, here we're going to do this. And all of a sudden, it's like David said, you're sitting down, got your drink, the donut you got from the front or whatever, and you're sitting down. It's okay, now entertain me. And I think that's what David was feeling. And we kind of noticed that. It was just a different feel than what it was when you were shoulder to shoulder in the gym. Which
Well, and this,
proved you were really shoulder to shoulder.
and the new room is different. In that most contemporary worship services are mobile. Nothing is fixed in a room. And in the new room, you have a fixed seating, which is kind of unusual. I know Asbury over in Madison, when they built their contemporary worship center, they went with fixed seating. But just about anywhere else, it's like folding chairs. You can face this way one Sunday and this way the next, or you can spread them out so you don't bump shoulders. So it does make a difference in the atmosphere of what's going on.
You hit on a very key point. We were in the gym and started that. You had a critical mass.
Yeah.
People were there and you're sitting next to each other. Today you got people sitting 14 seats apart. For years I've been telling them to rope off the balcony until they fill the lower part and then open it. But we don't get anywhere. And I'll tell you, when you're on that stage and you're preaching or teaching, it's dark out there. You can't see anything. You don't know who you're talking to. And that disconnects you from the audience. And that is a real detriment.
Well, when the kids were young, we'd come in and turn to the right, and that whole section was full.
Kids.
And now, we came in, we went there like months ago or something. We went in, and there was nobody there. And there's really
Sitting down front.
just count the number of people that were in the whole
It's kind of interesting.
place.
It's interesting, kind of you're teaching this from a perspective of having seen all different types, through a number of years, and just something you said kind of an epiphany moment for me. If I go into the new room here, I'm not really sweating the details. And we've, certainly post COVID, when we started coming back, it was very empty, very sparse. And I missed a little bit of the energy, but it didn't put me down. I still, as we get older and we get a little more wiser, I'm more determined to pull from this experience what I need.
Right.
But the younger me, David, at his age, I think they're looking for that connection. So it's this kind of, maybe it matters more to the younger generation.
Right.
So David's on kind of a journey to find what he's looking for. And we're proud that he's looking and he's trying different things in different churches. And so I think that's good that he's.
Well, we'll talk about some of that dynamic next week when we talk about post-COVID church. Well, next week we'll hit 2 chapters next week and we'll wind this thing up. We've got the church post-COVID, which is the major update of the text itself. And then I have a little section called A View from the Edge of the Cloud, which is my kind of general perspective on where this journey has taken me and maybe where you find yourself in that. So that's what we'll talk about next week. Let's have a prayer. Lord, to give you thanks that in your great wisdom you have provided for us a place to worship however we want to worship, as long as we call out your name and seek your face. Surround us with your love and your wisdom as we move from here. Protect us as we go home. For I pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Started out. Dark, I mean, dark.
That thing,